I found out that my new neighbor was the HOA president exactly 3 hours before the first major blizzard of the season was supposed to hit our little slice of Montana hell. And by then, it was already too late to do anything except watch my carefully laid plans crumble like snow under a plow. My name is Yates Emerson, and I had just moved to Whitefish, Montana in late October, buying a gorgeous 2-acre property on the edge of the Elk Ridge Estates development. The house was a dream, a modern craftsman with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the Flathead Valley, and I had big plans for my first winter there. I work remotely as a software engineer, so I could live anywhere, and I had chosen Montana specifically because I love winter sports and the rugged outdoors. What I did not love, however, was the bureaucratic nightmare that came with living in an HOA community, something I had somehow glossed over during the buying process. The property had been vacant for 2 years before I bought it, and the previous owners had apparently been snowbirds who spent their winters in Arizona. They had never dealt with the full brunt of Montana winter living, which meant they had never installed any of the protective measures that someone actually residing there year-round would need. The back of my property faced northwest, directly into the prevailing winds that screamed down from the mountains. Without proper snow fencing, those winds would create massive drifts that could bury my driveway, my garage, and basically trap me in my house for days after every storm. I had done my research. I had consulted with 3 different local contractors who all told me the same thing, that I needed to install snow fencing about 100 feet upwind of my house to break up those drifts before they became a problem. The fencing would not be pretty, just orange plastic mesh stretched between metal posts, but it would be temporary, coming down every spring. It was a standard practice in rural Montana, and I had seen similar setups on dozens of properties driving through the area. What I had not anticipated was Sharon Patterson. Sharon lived in the house directly adjacent to mine, a sprawling ranch-style place that she had apparently lived in since the development was first built 15 years ago. She was in her early 50s, with that particular haircut that seems to be issued along with a certain mindset, short, aggressively layered, and highlighted in a way that suggested she asked to speak to the manager of the salon on a regular basis. I met her for the first time when I was out surveying my property line, trying to figure out exactly where to place the snow fence posts. "You must be the new owner," she said, appearing seemingly out of nowhere. She wore a puffy North Face jacket and designer snow boots that looked like they had never actually touched snow. "Sharon Patterson, HOA president, welcome to Elk Ridge Estates." I straightened up from where I had been kneeling next to a survey stake and offered my hand. "Yates Emerson." "Thanks, I am really excited to be here." Her handshake was limp and brief. Her eyes were already scanning the stakes I had placed, her expression souring. "What exactly are you doing out here?" "Getting ready to install snow fencing," I said, gesturing toward the line of stakes. "The back of my property takes the full force of the northwest winds, so I need to get this up before the first big storm. Actually, the Weather Service is predicting one for tomorrow night, so I have got a crew coming first thing in the morning to get it installed." Sharon's face did something complicated, a progression of expressions that went from confusion to realization to barely concealed anger in about 3 seconds. "Snow fencing? You mean those ugly orange things?" "They are temporary," I said, trying to keep my voice pleasant. "They come down in spring. But without them, I will have drifts that could be 10, 12 feet high right up against my house and garage. It is pretty standard around here." "Not in Elk Ridge Estates, it is not," Sharon said, her voice taking on a sharp edge. "We have community standards, Mr. Emerson, Aesthetic guidelines. Did you not receive the HOA packet when you closed on the property? I had received a packet, a thick manila envelope that I had admittedly only skimmed through. It had seemed like the usual HOA nonsense, keeping your lawn mowed, no purple houses, no parking RVs in your driveway, that kind of thing. I had not seen anything about snow fencing. I got the packet, but I did not see anything about temporary seasonal snow barriers. It falls under Section 7.4, subsection B, Sharon said, pulling out her phone and scrolling with her thumb. No temporary structures or installations that detract from the aesthetic harmony of the community. That would include snow fencing. With respect, Sharon, snow fencing is not about aesthetics. It is about safety and practicality. Without it, my property becomes basically unusable every time it snows. She looked up from her phone, and her smile was thin and utterly without warmth. Then perhaps you should have considered that before purchasing property in a community with standards. I'm afraid I cannot approve any snow fencing installation. As HOA president, I have to maintain the visual integrity of our neighborhood. My stomach sank. Cannot approve it. Don't I have a right to protect my property from weather damage? You have a right to follow the HOA guidelines that you agreed to when you purchased your home, Sharon said. Those guidelines exist to protect everyone's property values. If I let you put up orange plastic fencing, what is next? Someone wants to install above-ground pools. Someone wants to put up a shed. We have standards for a reason. This is completely different, I said, feeling my frustration rising. This is about basic property management in a harsh winter climate. Ask anyone who actually lives here year-round. They will tell you that snow fencing is necessary. I live here year-round, Sharon said coldly, and I have never needed snow fencing. Perhaps if you had done your due diligence before buying, you would have purchased a property with a more favorable orientation. I stared at her, trying to process the sheer absurdity of what she was saying. Your house faces east. You do not get the northwest winds like I do. Our situations are not comparable. Regardless, my decision stands. No snow fencing. If you proceed with the installation, I will have no choice but to fine you for HOA violations, starting at $500 and increasing by $250 for every day the violation continues. She gave me that same cold smile. I suggest you call your crew and cancel. Have a wonderful day, Mr. Emerson. She turned and walked back toward her house, leaving me standing there in the growing wind, surrounded by survey stakes that suddenly felt utterly pointless. I spent the rest of that afternoon on the phone. First with my real estate agent, who apologetically confirmed that yes, I had technically agreed to all HOA rules and regulations as part of the purchase agreement. Then with a lawyer who specialized in HOA disputes, who told me that fighting this would be expensive, time-consuming, and uncertain in its outcome. Montana law generally sided with property owners on practical matters, but HOAs had broad authority to enforce their covenants, and proving that snow fencing was a necessity rather than a preference would require documentation, expert testimony, and possibly years of litigation. My advice. The lawyer said, try to work with the HOA board. Present your case at the next board meeting. Get some of your neighbors on your side. HOA presidents have a lot of power, but they are not dictators. If you can convince the rest of the board, they can overrule her. The next board meeting was not until December 15th, 6 weeks away. The storm was coming tomorrow night. I called the contractor and canceled the installation, forfeiting my deposit in the process. Then I sat in my beautiful house with its stunning views and watched the wind pick up outside. already swirling loose snow into ominous patterns across my backyard. The storm hit right on schedule, rolling in around midnight with the kind of ferocity that reminded me why Montana winters are not for the faint of heart. I woke up the next morning to a complete whiteout, winds howling at what had to be 50 miles per hour, and snow coming down so thick I could barely see 20 feet past my windows. The storm continued for 36 hours straight, dumping nearly 3 feet of snow and creating drifts that transformed the entire landscape. When it finally cleared, the damage to my property was exactly what every contractor had warned me about. The northwest winds had pushed massive drifts against the back of my house, burying my first-floor windows up to their frames. The drift against my garage was even worse, a solid wall of snow at least 10 feet high that completely blocked both garage doors. My driveway, which wound around the side of the house, was buried under 4 feet of packed snow. It took me 6 hours with a snowblower and a shovel to even create a path to my front door. Meanwhile, I could see Sharon's property from my side windows. Her house sat pretty and pristine, just a few inches of snow on her driveway, no drifts at all. The wind patterns had essentially given her a free pass while destroying my property's accessibility. I spent the next 2 days digging out, hiring a guy with a front-end loader to clear the massive drifts from my garage and the back of my house. It cost me $1,200 and countless hours of my own labor. By the time I was done, I was exhausted, frustrated, and absolutely furious with Sharon Patterson. The day after I finally got clear, I saw her out checking her mailbox. I walked over, trying to keep my anger in check. "Sharon, we need to talk about the snow fencing situation." She barely glanced at me. "I thought I was very clear about the HOA position on that." "You were clear, but you were also wrong. Look at my property. Look at the damage those drifts caused. I had to spend over $1,000 just to dig out from a single storm. This is not sustainable." "That sounds like a personal problem," Sharon said, pulling envelopes from her mailbox. "Perhaps you could consider parking your vehicles outside during storm season so your garage doors would not matter as much." "That is not a solution, Sharon. This is about basic property use." "I am coming to the December board meeting, and I am bringing documentation about why this is necessary." "You are welcome to attend," she said, "but the outcome will not change. I have lived in this community for 15 years, Mr. Emerson. I know what is best for maintaining our property values and our standards. Some urban transplant who has been here for 5 minutes does not get to come in and trash our aesthetic just because he bought the wrong lot." Urban transplant. I had grown up in Billings, Montana, hardly an urban metropolis, but I bit back my retort and just nodded. "See you in December." Over the next few weeks, I did my homework. I talked to every neighbor I could find, explained my situation, and asked for their support at the upcoming board meeting. The reactions were mixed. Some people were sympathetic but unwilling to cross Sharon, who apparently had a reputation for retaliating against anyone who challenged her authority. Others agreed that the HOA rules were too rigid but did not want to get involved. A few told me outright that they liked the way the neighborhood looked and did not want to see orange fencing anywhere, regardless of the practical necessity. I found one ally in Marcus Chen, a younger guy who lived 3 houses down and had his own grievances with Sharon. She had fined him repeatedly for parking his work truck in his driveway, claiming it violated the commercial vehicle restrictions, even though it was just a regular pickup with his landscaping company logo on the side. "She is on a power trip," Marcus told me over coffee at a local shop. "But good luck getting the board to stand up to her. Two of the other board members are her friends, and the other two are too scared to vote against her. So the board meetings are just a rubber stamp for whatever she wants, pretty much. But you should still present your case. Get it on the record. If you end up having to sue the HOA, you will want to show that you tried to work within the system first. I did not want to sue the HOA. I just wanted to install some damn snow fencing. The second major storm hit in late November, and the pattern repeated itself. Massive drifts against my house and garage, days of backbreaking work to dig out, another $1,000 to the guy with the front-end loader. Meanwhile, Sharon's house remained virtually untouched by drifts. I started to realize something about the geography of our properties. The way the wind patterns worked, my lack of snow fencing was not just failing to protect my property. It was actually creating a barrier that redirected some of the wind and snow away from Sharon's place. Without my snow fence, the drifts built up on my land and created a wall that sheltered her from the worst of the storm's effects. In other words, Sharon was benefiting from the very situation she had forced me into. I spent hours analyzing weather data, wind patterns, and topography maps. I documented everything with photos and measurements. I prepared a comprehensive presentation for the December board meeting, complete with expert opinions from 3 different contractors and a meteorologist from Montana State University, who confirmed that snow fencing was not just helpful but essentially necessary for a property with my exposure. The December board meeting was held in the community clubhouse, a small building near the development's entrance that mostly got used for the occasional resident's birthday party. I arrived early with my laptop and a stack of printed documentation. About 20 residents showed up, which Marcus told me was a good turnout. Most meetings only drew 5 or 6 people. Sharon sat at the front table with the other 4 board members. There was Linda Morrison, a retired teacher who seemed nice enough. Tom Westbrook, who owned a car dealership in town and clearly did not want to be there. Patricia Ford, one of Sharon's close friends who kept shooting me hostile looks. And David Kim, a software developer like me who seemed deeply uncomfortable with the whole situation. Sharon called the meeting to order and went through the standard agenda items, approving the previous month's minutes, discussing some landscaping proposals for the common areas, and addressing a complaint about someone's barking dog. Then she got to new business. "We have a request from Mr. Emerson to present regarding snow fencing," Sharon said, her tone making it clear what she thought of the request. "Mr. Emerson, you have 10 minutes. I stood up and moved to the front, connecting my laptop to the projector. "Thank you. As most of you know, I purchased the property at 47 Ridgeline Drive in October. What I did not fully understand at the time was how severely the wind and snow patterns would affect my property during winter storms. I walked them through everything, the photos of the massive drifts, the documentation from contractors, the meteorologist's analysis, the cost of repeatedly digging out, the safety concerns about being unable to access my garage or even my house during extended storms. I showed them examples of other properties in the area, outside the HOA, that used snow fencing without any apparent impact on property values or community aesthetics. "This is not about circumventing HOA rules for my own convenience," I said. "This is about basic habitability of my property during Montana winters. The fencing is temporary, it is minimally invasive, and it is absolutely necessary. I am asking the board to grant an exception to Section 7.4, subsection B, to allow seasonal snow fencing installation." I sat down, and Sharon immediately spoke up. "Thank you for that presentation, Mr. Emerson. However, I think you are overstating the necessity of this installation. Plenty of properties in this area manage just fine without snow fencing. The fact that you are experiencing some drifting is unfortunate, but it does not rise to the level of justifying an aesthetic exception. Some drifting, I said, unable to keep the incredulity out of my voice. Sharon, the drifts are 10 feet high. They completely bury my garage. How is that not justifying an exception? Other residents manage, she said coldly. Perhaps with better snow removal planning, you could mitigate these issues without resorting to unsightly barriers. Marcus stood up from the back. I think Yates has made a pretty compelling case. This seems like a situation where practical necessity should override aesthetic concerns. We are talking about someone being able to use their property, not just cosmetic preferences. And who are you to determine what constitutes necessity? Patricia Ford snapped. We have rules for a reason. If we start making exceptions for everyone who finds the rules inconvenient, we might as well not have an HOA at all. This is not about inconvenience, I said. This is about thousands of dollars in damage and safety concerns. Sharon held up her hand. I think we have heard enough debate. Board members, I move that we deny Mr. Emerson's request for an exception to install snow fencing. Do I have a second? Second, Patricia said immediately. All in favor. Sharon and Patricia raised their hands immediately. Tom Westbrook hesitated, then raised his hand with a grimace. Linda Morrison looked torn but ultimately kept her hand down. David Kim also kept his hand down. Motion passes 3-2, Sharon said. Mr. Emerson, your request is denied. Next item on the agenda, wait, I said, standing up. That is it. You are just going to ignore all the evidence I presented. The expert testimony, the documented costs and safety concerns. We are not ignoring anything, Sharon said. We are making a decision based on what is best for the entire community, not just one individual homeowner. Your property challenges do not supersede the collective interest in maintaining our aesthetic standards. My property challenges exist because of the natural geography that I cannot control, I said, my voice rising. You are essentially telling me that I have to spend thousands of dollars every winter and potentially put my safety at risk because you do not like the way orange fencing looks. I am telling you that you agreed to abide by HOA rules when you purchased your property, Sharon said, her voice ice cold. If you find those rules unacceptable, perhaps you should consider selling and finding a property that better suits your needs. This meeting is adjourned. I walked out of that meeting absolutely furious, with Marcus following behind me. That was complete bullshit, he said once we were outside. She had her mind made up before you even started talking. I noticed, I said bitterly. What are my options now, legally? You could sue the HOA, but that is expensive and slow. You could file a complaint with the state, but I do not know if they handle this kind of thing. Or you could just install the fencing anyway and fight the fines. I considered that option. $500 for the initial violation, plus $250 per day. If the fencing stayed up from December through March, that would be something like $30,000 in fines. I could not afford that, and I doubted I would win if the HOA took me to court over it. There has to be another way, I said. Marcus shrugged. Sometimes with people like Sharon, the only thing that works is making them experience the consequences of their own decisions. But I do not know how you would do that in this situation. I went home that night and sat in my living room, staring out at my property and thinking about what Marcus had said. Making Sharon experience the consequences of her own decisions. The problem was, Sharon was not experiencing any consequences. Her property was fine. She was benefiting from my lack of snow fencing while facing none of the downsides. But what if that changed? I pulled up the topography maps again. studying the exact contours of the land. My property sat slightly uphill from Sharon's, and the prevailing northwest winds came across my land before hitting hers. The natural drift patterns pushed snow from my property toward hers, but the massive drifts that built up on my land were actually creating a barrier that blocked some of that snow from reaching her house. If I managed the snow on my property differently, I could change those patterns. Snow fencing works by creating an upwind barrier that forces snow to settle before it reaches the area you are trying to protect. But the same principle works in reverse. If you remove barriers and create channels, you can direct snow flow towards specific areas. It is basic physics and meteorology. I spent the next week doing careful calculations and consultations with the meteorologist I had hired for my HOA presentation. I explained what I was thinking, and he confirmed that yes, it would work. If I strategically managed the snow on my property, creating channels and removing the drift barriers, I could redirect the natural wind flow to push significantly more snow toward Sharon's property. It is completely legal, the meteorologist confirmed. You are just managing snow on your own property. You are not installing any structures or doing anything that would violate HOA rules. You are just choosing where to clear snow and where to leave it. And it would definitely impact her property. Based on these topography maps and the prevailing wind patterns, absolutely, you would probably triple the amount of snow that drifts onto her property, maybe more. I smiled for the first time in weeks. Perfect. The next major storm was predicted for the day after Christmas. I spent Christmas Day preparing, using my snowblower to create precise channels across my property, angling them to direct wind flow toward Sharon's house. I left the existing drifts on the northwest side intact, but carved pathways through them that would funnel wind like a jet stream. I cleared my driveway and the area immediately around my house, but left everything else in strategic patterns designed to maximize snow deposition on Sharon's property. The storm hit right on schedule, another monster that dropped 2.5 feet of snow over 48 hours. I watched from my windows as the wind patterns played out exactly as predicted. The channels I had created funneled the northwest winds directly toward Sharon's house, carrying massive amounts of blowing snow. Without the barrier that my previous drift walls had created, the snow slammed into her property with full force. When the storm cleared, the results were spectacular. My property looked odd, with strange cleared channels and strategic drift walls, but my house and garage were accessible. I had done just enough clearing to maintain my own functionality. Sharon's property, on the other hand, looked like it had been hit by an avalanche. Massive drifts covered her entire backyard, buried her deck, and pushed against her house in ways I had never seen before. Her driveway had a drift across it that had to be 6 feet high. One of her garage doors was completely buried. Her propane tank was surrounded by a wall of snow that would need to be cleared for safety reasons. I watched through my window as she came outside the next morning, saw the devastation, and just stood there in apparent shock. Then she started making phone calls. The guy with the front-end loader that I had been using showed up a few hours later and spent the entire day clearing her property. I later found out she paid him almost $2,000. I did not talk to Sharon for the next week. I did not need to. The evidence was all around us. The next storm came in mid-January, and I repeated my strategy. Strategic snow management on my property, careful channeling of wind patterns, and the results were the same. Massive drifts on Sharon's property, minimal impact on mine. Another expensive dig out for her, another easy cleanup for me. After the third storm and the third catastrophic drift event on her property, Sharon finally came over. I watched her trudge through the snow toward my front door, and I took my time answering her knock. "We need to talk," she said when I opened the door. Her face was red from cold and anger. "About what?" "About what you are doing to my property," she snapped. "You are deliberately causing snow to drift onto my land. I know you are doing it on purpose." "I am managing snow on my own property," I said calmly. "I am not installing any structures. I am not violating any HOA guidelines. I am just clearing snow in a way that works best for me. You are channeling it directly at my house. I am clearing the areas I need to access while leaving other areas undisturbed. What happens to the wind patterns after that is not really my concern." Her face went even redder. "This is harassment. This is targeted harassment, and I could sue you for it. For clearing snow on my own property in a pattern that I find convenient." I raised my eyebrows. "Good luck with that. But hey, I have got a solution that would fix both our problems." She stared at me, and I could see the realization dawning in her eyes. "The snow fencing." "The snow fencing," I confirmed. "If I could install proper snow fencing on my property, it would manage the drift patterns in a way that protects both our properties." "Of course, you blocked that at the HOA meeting, so I have to work with the tools I have available, which apparently means strategic snow clearing that just happens to redirect wind patterns." "This is blackmail," she hissed. "This is property management," I said. "You made a decision about what I could and could not do with my land. I am respecting that decision and working within the constraints you imposed. If you do not like the results, maybe the HOA should reconsider its position. I am going to report this to the board." "Please do," I said. "I will be happy to explain my snow management strategy and how it complies with all HOA regulations. Have a great day, Sharon." I closed the door in her face and watched through the window as she stomped back to her house. I felt a grim satisfaction, but also a nagging worry. Sharon was not the type to just accept defeat. She would retaliate somehow. The retaliation came in the form of a formal HOA complaint. A week later, I received a certified letter informing me that I was being fined $500 for malicious property management designed to harm neighboring properties. The letter cited Section 12.7, which prohibited any action taken with the specific intent to damage or decrease the value of other properties in the development. I called my lawyer immediately. "Can they actually do this?" He read through the complaint and laughed. "They can try, but this is not going to hold up. Proving intent is almost impossible in this situation, and you have got a clear, legitimate reason for clearing snow the way you are doing. You are maintaining access to your property. The fact that it has secondary effects on wind patterns is not your responsibility. I would fight this." I drafted a response denying the allegations and requesting a formal hearing. The hearing was scheduled for late January, and I prepared my case carefully. I documented every instance of my snow clearing, explaining exactly why I had cleared each area and how it served my legitimate property management needs. I brought in the meteorologist again to testify that wind patterns in mountainous terrain are complex and unpredictable, and that it would be impossible to clear snow without having some impact on how wind moved across the broader area. The hearing was tense. Sharon presented photos of the drifts on her property, testimony from her about the costs she had incurred, and her assertion that I was deliberately targeting her in revenge for the snow fencing decision. I presented my documentation, my expert testimony, and my argument that I was simply managing my property in a way that was both legal and necessary. The board voted 3-2 again, but this time in my favor. Linda Morrison and David Kim voted to dismiss the complaint, and surprisingly, Tom Westbrook joined them. "I think Sharon is right that this seems targeted," he said, "but I do not think we can find someone for clearing snow on their own property, regardless of their motivation. That opens up a legal can of worms we do not want to deal with." Sharon was furious, but the decision stood. My fine was rescinded, and I was free to continue my snow management strategy. The storms kept coming throughout January and February, as Montana winters do. Each time, I maintained my careful pattern of snow clearing, and each time, Sharon's property got hammered with massive drifts while mine remained relatively accessible. I kept detailed records of everything, including her steadily mounting costs for snow removal. By my calculation, she spent over $8,000 that winter dealing with drifts that would not have existed if she had just let me install the snow fencing in the first place. Other neighbors started to notice. Some of them thought what I was doing was hilarious, a perfect example of malicious compliance. Others thought I was being petty and vindictive. A few approached Sharon and suggested that maybe she should reconsider the snow fencing issue, which she apparently took as a personal betrayal. In late February, Marcus called me with interesting news. "You are not going to believe this, but 3 people have submitted nomination forms to run for the HOA board in the spring election. That has not happened in years. Usually Sharon and her friends just run unopposed. Who is running?" "Me, for one. I figure if we are going to have an HOA, it should actually serve the homeowners instead of Sharon's ego, and Lisa Bernard and Mike Torres. They are both tired of the way Sharon runs things." "When is the election?" "April." "If we can get at least 2 of the new candidates elected, we would have the votes to overrule Sharon on pretty much everything." I felt a surge of hope for the first time in months. That would be incredible. The thing is, we need to campaign. We need to convince people that change is necessary. And your situation with the snow fencing is actually a perfect example of why Sharon's approach does not work. You tried to do things the right way. She blocked you for purely aesthetic reasons, and now everyone is worse off. Over the next month, I became deeply involved in the HOA election campaign. It was not something I had ever imagined myself doing, but I was motivated by sheer frustration with the existing system. Marcus, Lisa, and Mike all ran on a platform of reasonable governance, promising to balance community standards with practical homeowner needs. Sharon fought back hard. She sent multiple emails to all residents warning about the dangers of letting the neighborhood become a trailer park without strict aesthetic controls. She organized a group of her supporters to go door-to-door campaigning for the incumbent board members. She even tried to schedule the annual meeting at a time when she knew Mike would be out of town, though enough residents complained that she had to change it. The annual meeting and election in early April drew an unprecedented crowd. Nearly every homeowner in the development showed up, packing the clubhouse beyond capacity. The energy was tense, with clear factions forming between Sharon's supporters and those who wanted change. The election results were close, but decisive. Marcus won his race by 15 votes. Lisa won hers by 8. Mike lost his by 3 votes, which was disappointing, but the math still worked out. With Linda Morrison and David Kim, who had voted against Sharon on several recent issues, the reformers had a 4-3 majority on the board. Sharon's face, as the results were announced, was a mask of barely controlled fury. She knew exactly what this meant, that her absolute control over the HOA was over. The new board held its first meeting in late April, and the first item on the agenda was a motion to revise Section 7.4, Subsection B to allow temporary seasonal snow fencing installations that met certain standards regarding placement, materials, and removal schedules. The motion passed 4-3. I submitted my application for snow fencing installation the next day, and it was approved within a week. By early May, Montana's winter was finally breaking. The snow was melting, revealing the scarred battlefield of my property and Sharon's. I spent a weekend doing major cleanup, hauling away debris and preparing the land for spring. Sharon did the same, though I noticed she avoided looking in my direction whenever we were both outside. I installed my snow fencing in October, before the first storms of the next season. It went up quickly. Simple orange mesh stretched between metal posts, ugly but functional. When the first major storm hit in November, the results were exactly what the contractors had predicted. The fencing caught the blowing snow well upwind of my house, creating manageable drifts that were easy to clear. My driveway stayed accessible, my garage stayed clear, and my house remained fully functional throughout the storm. Sharon's property. No longer benefiting from the drift patterns my unprotected property had created, experienced normal winter conditions. Not as bad as what she had dealt with the previous winter when I was channeling wind toward her, but definitely more snow and drifting than she had been used to in previous years. She hired a snow removal service on a seasonal contract, which I heard cost her several $1,000s. We did not speak for months. The Cold War between us continued through the winter and into the following spring. But something interesting happened as the seasons changed and time passed. Other homeowners started installing snow fencing. 3 more properties went up that second winter, all of them with similar exposure issues to mine. The neighborhood aesthetic changed slightly, but the functionality improved dramatically for those homeowners. Sharon remained on the HOA board but no longer as president. Marcus had been elected president by the new majority, and the culture of the HOA shifted significantly. There was more emphasis on practical problem solving and less on rigid aesthetic control. Sharon fought against most of the new initiatives, but she was consistently outvoted. I saw her at the grocery store in town one day in March, almost 18 months after our initial confrontation. We were both in the produce section, and there was no way to avoid each other without being obvious about it. I nodded at her, and to my surprise, she nodded back. "Your fencing worked," she said after a moment. It was not quite an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. "It did," I said. "I wish it had not taken all that trouble to get it approved." She was quiet for a moment, and I thought she might just walk away. But then she said, "I was trying to protect the neighborhood, the property values, the way things had always been." "I understand that," I said, and I meant it. "But sometimes the way things have always been does not work for everyone. Sometimes you have to adapt." She did not respond to that, just gave me a long look and then walked away. It was not a reconciliation, not really, but it was something. An acknowledgement that we had both been part of a conflict that had spiraled beyond what either of us had intended. Life in Elk Ridge Estates settled into a new normal. The HOA still had rules and standards, but they were applied with more flexibility and common sense. Homeowners who needed practical modifications to deal with Montana's harsh winters were generally accommodated, as long as they were reasonable about it. The neighborhood remained attractive and well-maintained, but it also became more livable for people who actually resided there year-round. I kept my snow fencing up from October through April each year, and it saved me thousands of dollars and countless hours of labor. My property remained functional and accessible even during the worst storms. I was able to enjoy my Montana winters the way I had always imagined, skiing on weekends, working from my beautiful home, and living in one of the most stunning places in the country, without the constant stress of being trapped by snow. Sharon and I never became friends, but we reached a kind of détente. We nodded to each other when we crossed paths. We coexisted. She continued to serve on the HOA board, and her voice still carried weight, but she was no longer able to unilaterally impose her vision on everyone else. The whole experience taught me something important about HOAs, about community living, and about the fine line between reasonable standards and tyrannical control. HOAs can serve a valuable purpose in maintaining property values and creating pleasant neighborhoods. But when they become tools for individuals to impose their personal preferences on everyone else, when they prioritize aesthetics over livability and rigid rules over common sense, they become oppressive and destructive. I also learned something about conflict and resolution. My strategy of redirecting snow onto Sharon's property had been effective in making my point, but it had also been vindictive. It had escalated the situation and created lasting animosity. In retrospect, I might have done things differently. I might have tried harder to organize community support before the first board meeting. I might have been more diplomatic in my initial conversations with Sharon. But then again, maybe the conflict was necessary. Maybe Sharon needed to experience the consequences of her inflexibility before she would even consider changing her position. Maybe the rest of the community needed to see the absurdity of the situation before they would be motivated to vote for new board members. Marcus and I became good friends through the whole ordeal. We met for coffee regularly and joked about our HOA resistance days. Lisa and Mike also became part of our friend group, and we occasionally had dinner parties where we swapped stories about the worst HOA complaints we had seen. The neighborhood itself improved in subtle ways. People seemed more willing to talk to each other, to work through disputes directly rather than immediately filing HOA complaints. The board still enforced rules, but they did so with more discretion and flexibility. A couple who wanted to paint their house a slightly different shade of gray than the approved palette was allowed to do so after showing the board samples. A family who needed to install a wheelchair ramp was expedited through the approval process rather than being buried in red tape. Sharon slowly, grudgingly, adapted to the new culture. She still pushed back on what she considered unnecessary rule changes, but she was less reflexively opposed to everything. I saw her at a board meeting once where someone was requesting approval for a solar panel installation, something she had opposed for years on aesthetic grounds. This time, after hearing the homeowner's explanation about energy costs and environmental concerns, she voted to approve it. It was a small thing, but it felt significant. By the time my third winter in Elk Ridge Estates rolled around, I had fully settled into my life there. My snow fencing went up and came down like clockwork. My property stayed functional and beautiful. I had built a real community of friends in the neighborhood. I had even started dating someone I met at a local ski resort, a relationship that was getting serious. Montana winters were still brutal, with storms that could bury the landscape in snow and winds that howled down from the mountains with terrifying force. But I was prepared for them now. I had the right systems in place, the right strategies, and the right support from my community. The whole situation with Sharon and the snow fencing had been exhausting and frustrating, but it had also forced me to become more involved in my community, to stand up for what I believed was right, and to help create a better system for everyone. In a strange way, I was almost grateful for the conflict. It had shaped my experience of living in Montana, had connected me with people I would not have otherwise met, and had taught me valuable lessons about advocacy, community organizing, and the importance of fighting for reasonable governance. I kept the detailed records from that first winter in a folder on my computer, a chronicle of measurements, photos, weather data, and correspondence. Every now and then I would look through them and remember the anger and frustration I had felt, but also the satisfaction of finding a creative solution, even if it had been a vindictive one. Those records were a reminder that sometimes you have to stand up to unreasonable authority, that sometimes you have to get creative in fighting back, and that persistence and strategy can overcome even the most obstinate opposition. The snow fence stood on my property now, simple and functional, exactly what I had wanted from the beginning. It was not pretty, just orange plastic mesh and metal posts. But it did its job perfectly, protecting my property from the worst of Montana's winter fury, allowing me to live comfortably and safely in the place I had chosen to call home. And that, ultimately, was all I had ever wanted. Not revenge, not victory, not the satisfaction of proving Sharon wrong. Just the ability to live peacefully in my own home, to protect my property from predictable weather patterns, to make reasonable decisions about my own land. The fact that it had required a winter-long campaign of strategic snow management, an HOA board election, and a complete restructuring of neighborhood governance, just to achieve that simple goal, was both absurd and sadly typical of the way HOAs can function when they are controlled by individuals more concerned with power than with service. But we had gotten there in the end. The system had changed, slowly and painfully, but it had changed. And now, when someone new moved into Elk Ridge Estates and needed to make a reasonable modification to their property to deal with Montana's harsh climate, they would not face the same obstruction I had faced. They would find a board willing to listen, willing to consider practical necessity alongside aesthetic concerns, willing to approve sensible requests. That was Sharon's legacy, though she would never see it that way. Her inflexibility had sparked a reform movement that had made the entire community better, more livable, more reasonable. Her attempt to maintain absolute control had resulted in her losing most of her power. Her refusal to accommodate my snow fencing had led directly to a neighborhood where snow fencing and similar practical installations were not just allowed but encouraged. I thought about all of this one evening in late November, as the first major storm of my fourth winter in Montana approached. I stood at my living room window, looking out at my property with its snow fencing already in place, ready for whatever the winter would throw at it. The sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, the kind of Montana sunset that reminded me why I had moved here in the first place. Sharon's house was visible through the trees, smoke rising from her chimney as she prepared for the coming storm. Her property now had a small section of snow fencing too, something I had noticed going up in late October. She had not asked for my advice, had not acknowledged the irony, but there it was. Even Sharon Patterson had eventually accepted that practical necessity sometimes trumps aesthetic preference. The wind was already picking up, swirling loose snow in ghostly patterns across the landscape. By morning, the world would be white and wild, transformed by another Montana blizzard. But my house would be safe, my driveway would be accessible, and my garage would remain clear. The snow fencing would do its job, the same job it could have been doing since my first winter here if Sharon had just listened to reason from the beginning. I smiled to myself, turned away from the window, and went to make dinner. The storm would come, the snow would fall, and the drifts would pile up exactly where I wanted them to, safely away from my house and garage. and Sharon would deal with her own property management challenges, just like everyone else, no longer sheltered by the unintended consequences of her own obstruction. It was not a perfect ending. Sharon and I would never be friends. The damage from that first winter of conflict, both financial and personal, could not be undone. But it was a fair ending, a just ending. The system had been broken and we had fixed it, painfully and slowly, but we had fixed it. And now Elk Ridge Estates was a better place to live, not just for me, but for everyone who valued common sense over rigid adherence to arbitrary rules. The snow began to fall as darkness settled over the valley, fat flakes swirling in the wind, the beginning of another long Montana winter. I settled into my couch with a book, warm and comfortable, secure in the knowledge that my home was protected. My preparations were complete, and I had earned the right to enjoy this place in peace. Outside, the wind howled and the snow accumulated, nature indifferent to human conflicts and petty disputes. The mountains stood eternal and unmoved. The winter would do what winter always does in Montana, testing those who chose to live here, rewarding those who prepared properly, and punishing those who failed to respect its power. I had learned that lesson well, not just about winter, but about life in a community with an HOA. Preparation, persistence, and strategic thinking could overcome even the most frustrating obstacles. Change was possible, even in systems that seemed designed to resist it. And sometimes, the best revenge was not vindictive action, but simply living well, protecting what was yours and helping to build a better system for those who would come after. The storm raged through the night and into the next day, depositing nearly 2 feet of fresh snow across the valley. When it finally cleared, I went outside to assess the situation. My snow fencing had performed exactly as designed, creating manageable drifts well away from my house. My driveway had a few inches of snow that would take me maybe an hour to clear with the snowblower. My garage doors were completely accessible. It was perfect. I looked over at Sharon's property and saw her outside surveying her own situation. She had drifts too, but nothing catastrophic. Her snow fencing was helping, though I could see areas where she would need to do some digging. She glanced in my direction, and for a moment our eyes met across the snowy expanse. She did not wave, did not smile, but she gave a small nod. Acknowledgement. Respect, maybe, or at least acceptance. I nodded back and turned to get my snowblower, ready to clear my driveway and get on with my life. The conflict was over. The war had been won. And now it was just winter in Montana, beautiful and harsh, exactly what I had signed up for when I bought this incredible property with its stunning views and its complicated homeowner association. I fired up the snowblower and got to work, the machine's engine roaring in the crisp winter air. The snow was light and powdery, easy to clear. The sun was breaking through the clouds, turning the white landscape into a brilliant diamond field. It was going to be a good winter, I could feel it. Everything was as it should be, finally, after all the struggle and conflict and vindictive snow management. As I worked my way down the driveway, I thought about that first meeting with Sharon, when she had appeared out of nowhere to block my snow fencing installation. If I could go back and do it again, knowing everything I knew now, would I change anything? Would I try harder to compromise, to find middle ground, to avoid the escalating conflict that had consumed that entire winter? Maybe. But probably not. Some battles need to be fought. Some systems need to be challenged. And some people like Sharon need to learn that they cannot simply impose their will on everyone else without consequences. The fact that it had taken an entire winter of malicious snow management, an HOA election, and a complete restructuring of neighborhood governance to teach that lesson was unfortunate, but ultimately worth it. I finished clearing my driveway and put the snowblower away, satisfied with a morning's work well done. My home was secure, my property was functional, and my snow fencing stood like a line of plastic and metal soldiers, guarding against the next storm. It was everything I had wanted from the beginning, achieved through persistence, strategy, and a willingness to fight back against unreasonable authority. Montana winter stretched ahead of me, months of snow and cold and stunning beauty. I was ready for it now, finally, properly prepared with the right systems in place. And somewhere across the property line, Sharon was dealing with her own winter challenges, no longer able to benefit from blocking mine. It was petty, perhaps, to feel satisfaction in that. But after everything she had put me through, everything she had cost me in time and money and stress, I figured I was entitled to a little petness. The snow fencing was up, the storms would come and go, and Elk Ridge Estates would continue on under its new, more reasonable governance. That was the real victory, not my personal situation, but the broader change that had come from it. Other homeowners would benefit from the precedent we had set, from the reformed HOA board, from the new culture of practical problem-solving over rigid aesthetic control. It was a small thing in the grand scheme of the world, just one neighborhood in one corner of Montana learning to govern itself more effectively. But for those of us who lived there, who had fought that battle and won, it meant everything. It meant the difference between a home we loved and a place that made us miserable. It meant the difference between an HOA that served its residents and one that oppressed them. It meant that sometimes, when you stand up to bullies and fight back with creativity and determination, you actually can win. And that lesson, I thought as I walked back inside my warm, protected, beautifully situated home, was worth every frustrating moment of conflict, every dollar spent on snow removal, every hour of strategic planning and malicious compliance. The snow fencing stood ready for the next storm, and I stood ready for whatever came next, secure in the knowledge that I had fought for what was right and won.